Hi, I'm Beth Comstock, here for our latest Changemaker book club. I'm here with author Shane Snow. We're going to talk about how to build a dream team. Teaming isn't the stuff of nightmares, it's the stuff of dreams. And Shane's going to show us how. Just to set the stage, if you're joining us for the first time, we do this book club on a regular basis as a way to highlight great ideas and great writers, to bring it into the workplace. I've named this the Changemaker Book Club because I like to extract leadership lessons from great thinkers that help you lead forward. So this is really about kind of leading your way, making change in your team, in your organization. We invite you to send us questions, so just put questions in and we'll take them live. And I've gathered some questions that have come in social. So Changemaker Book Club, Dream Team, Shane Snow. Shane, for those of you who don't know, Shane is a science and business journalist, a founder of Contently, and a serial author. This is book number 2 for you, right?
Actually, book number 3.
Book number 3.
The second one I co-authored, so
Okay.
it's a little bit of a different beast.
Okay, so why did you write Dream Teams? What was the inspiration?
There's a few things. So even with any startup, there's this mythology of the clean version of the story.
Yeah.
The real version of the story is messier than, just like most things. But there were a couple of things afoot. I started seeing patterns of this thing that I was obsessing over everywhere, and I started writing about them. And that thing was that when different humans come together, that's when we have the most sort of potential energy to make music, to make magic, right? And really interested in the human behavior that drives group dynamics. But the pattern actually is a paradox, which is that when different human beings come together, that's when we invent weapons and that's when we fight. And there's this element that I was seeing in my own company where I went from a guy who does stuff to a guy who picks other people to do stuff and then mediate their fights, essentially, and try and eliminate politics and try to,
Doesn't sound very dreamy.
Yeah, and I wanted to understand what makes the kind of team that makes breakthroughs rather than breaks down. And when I started looking at statistics and when I started doing research, I realized that there's a lot of things about how we talk about teamwork that actually don't lead to breakthroughs, that actually lead to mediocre or happy but mediocre teams. Yeah. The other thing was, my father works in nuclear engineering, and I grew up taking things apart and putting them back together and learning from this engineer dad, sort of that curiosity. And so that's been a theme of my journalism career. I wanted to take apart group dynamics, teamwork, and put it back together in a modern way, new research. But I ran into this guy who, his job is to direct a thing called the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute.
Sounds like a really scary job.
Yeah, basically his job is to model out what could destroy humanity and then tell the United Nations. So I interviewed him for a story, and he said in no uncertain terms that nuclear technology is the most dangerous thing that puts humanity at risk.
And here your dad's at work doing that.
Yeah, and in that is that paradox, right? It took a lot of people to harness that energy, and that very same thing is at risk for all of us because we can't get along.
Yeah.
So that all boiled into this quest to understand that paradox at every level, from the nuclear war level down to the sort of two people who decide that they're going to be better together and get married level, and every kind of group in between.
Yeah, you have a great line just talking about how complicated, the things we're trying to do are just too important to do alone. And that's sort of the premise of your book. We're Changemaker Book Club. Invite you to send us questions. We're here live at WeWork. WeWork is all about working collaboratively. I mean, it's reinventing working collaboratively. You created your own company. You went from, I assume, just yourself to many people. What did you learn about building good teams?
Yeah, so many things, right? And that was part of the journey here with this book. One of the things about WeWork, when you bring it up, is part of the pitch is you have different people rubbing shoulders who are working on different things, and that actually can help you in whatever you're working on. And that's a pattern you see over and over and over again in research. Cities that have lots of immigrants produce more patents. They also have more fear and less voter participation, but that's exactly that paradox. Yeah. So what I saw in my company is there were 3 of us who started the company, and we have a lot of trust.
Were you a team in the beginning?
Yes. Yep. I had worked with one guy for several years, and the other guy was a childhood friend of mine. And we were all good at sort of pushing each other. Mm-hmm. And so we could have these really great debates and still have trust, and it never got personal. Yeah. And that dynamic got us from nothing to sort of the point where we had something real. And that filtered down into the dynamic of our company. So one of my observations with that I then explored in Dream Teams is how the role of conflict and friction between different ideas, different ways of seeing things is important. That's one of the lessons that I learned from my company that I then leaned into in research. But I kind of used this almost 4-year journey of researching and writing this book. I used my company as a little bit of a laboratory to workshop ideas, to give some presentations, keynotes that would then turn into chapters of the book. And we implemented a lot of things. So I learned a lot that I think has helped make Contently a special place to work, and a place where you can be yourself and still be part of something together, which is kind of this difficult actual thing to do.
In fact, you have a great quote in the book, which I feel so inspired by. Every once in a while we encounter, or sometimes are lucky enough to be part of, a magical moment when a group of people somehow become more than the sum of its parts. This is how breakthrough progress happens. On those rare occasions, we feel limitless. Like, I want to be part of that team. It's magic.
And
did you have that? Did you have that at Contently?
Very much in certain pockets, not all the time.
Yeah.
In fact, a
so
lot
I
of
think
times
that's important too, right? I mean, you're talking about tension and struggle. We'll get to the hows of that, but a dream team doesn't mean it's all just dreamy.
It's, getting along is actually not the secret. It's not getting along well, and you can do that as friends.
Yeah.
But if there's no discomfort, there's not going to be growth. So I very much, thank you. I like that, what I'm saying there, because we've all been there before.
Yeah, and it is magic. Let's jump right into the tension. You've brought it up. You talk about it being essential, this idea of conflict as necessary to get to the breakthroughs. Give us a couple of examples of some of your favorite stories. The book is really rich with storytelling. What are a couple of your of stories that you like? Maybe give us one where you think it tells a really good story about harnessing conflict.
Yeah. Once you start to see this, you see it everywhere.
Yeah.
My favorite one that's surprising is the story of the Wright Brothers.
I love that one too.
Yeah, they had this crazy process where they were brothers, right? So they grew up together, they had a lot of similar perspectives.
Yeah.
Not a good starting point for, the two heads are only going to be better than one if they think differently and they combine in the right ways, is basically the premise. So they were similar in a lot of ways. They were different in a lot of ways too, but they knew that they needed to push themselves further than they would see themselves. So their process was they have a challenge, they're trying to solve the problem of propelling the airplane forward or whatever it is this week. And they would get into these really heavy arguments where they would purposely take really strong stances on different sides of sort of this ideation process, and they would actually raise their voices, they would clash, they would fight. Their lab assistant said they got really hot, but we weren't sure if it was going to come to a fist fight or not, but it never seemed to do that. But then what they would do, is really cool, is it'd be lunchtime, they'd eat their sandwiches, they'd calm down, and then Orville would have to argue Wilbur's side in the afternoon.
I love this.
And vice versa. And there's so much there that, first of all, that forced them to not be married to being right, which is super important. You have to change your mind in order to get further than you can go on your own. The other is it sort of forced them to, sort of along those lines, to take ego out of the equation. Yeah. But they knew that their productivity or their progress was going to hinge on them being in this zone of friction.
Yeah.
And
they forced the friction.
They
forced it and worked their way through it.
Yeah, and they were brothers, so they could yell a little more than maybe you and I could if we were working together.
No, but I love that as, okay, we're going to have this discussion, then we're going to stop and change sides of the table. I think it's such
so it's
a
not
great
personal.
one.
It's not about winning. It's not about beating someone. It's about pushing the party forward.
Let's go from anger to fear. You have an example in the book about Chrysler as an example where fear kind of took over and the teaming didn't work. And talk about what you learned about fear. It seems to hold a lot of teams back.
Yes. So this analogy that friction is sort of the laboratory, the nuclear reactor, the atoms crash together, that's what makes the heat, and we can use that heat. But the problem is the nuclear reactor can blow up, it can melt down. Or the other analogy I use is the rubber band. The more you stretch it, the more tension it has. You can shoot it further, but at a certain point it snaps. And we're all afraid of that point where things snap. And so the important thing is to keep things in that zone. What happened with Daimler and Chrysler, it's the classic business school case study of a merger gone wrong. So it had all the ingredients on paper, two companies that complemented each other's weaknesses, deficiencies. They had a lot of cognitive diversity about car making. They were from different countries. There are all these ingredients that gave them potential to have that sort of healthy tension. And they'd read all the research about how culture conflict kills most mergers, not bad ideas. And so they were afraid of cultural conflict. So what they did is actually the opposite of what you're supposed to do. They held back. They didn't mix, they didn't trade people in offices. The CEOs kind of operated the companies as separate things. And it turned into basically the fear of conflict led them to not actually mix their ideas.
So it was a fear of conflict.
Yeah. This is actually the biggest leading indicator that a marriage is going to fail within the next 6 months. It's not how much you're arguing. It's if you've walked away from the arguments, if you've stopped talking.
So really force that discussion. Yeah. So we're Changemaker Book Club. We're taking questions. Speaking of questions, Shane, Robin says, fear is the biggest deterrent to putting forth great work. Do you have rules or guidelines that you'd recommend in certain meetings, teams coming together to recognize this fear?
Yeah, a lot of fear comes from interpersonal group dynamic fear comes from mostly in-group, out-group psychology, and they need to belong. So every human being processes every stranger into one of two groups, safe and question mark. In-group is safe. You look like me, you act like me, you behave like me, probably a member of my tribe. I can be a little more vulnerable. I can put better ideas out there that might be risky. That's fine. Someone who doesn't look like you, this is basically the story of xenophobia, is a question mark. And we are afraid of people who we don't understand and don't know. And so I think one of the biggest things, there's two things that are really big. If you have a group of people that there's potential there, but there's fear, you need to see everyone as a human being. You need to see them as individual human beings and not a category, especially that out-group category. And the thing to do there is to get to know people's story. There's a lot of great neuroscience around the more you can understand someone's human story and relate to the emotions they've felt in their lives, the more you include them in this safe group. The other thing is like the easiest trick for depressurizing a tense situation is humor. Actually, a lot of psychology around play and humor where it simulates anxiety, but you know it's safe and you walk out of the situation feeling better about people.
Things are tense, maybe find a reason to go have some fun, inject some humor.
Tell a joke about the elephant in the room. Don't just bring it up because everyone's going to freak out, but joke about it. And then that will allow people to breathe a sigh of relief and actually go for the thing they're afraid of.
I notice in times of change in the teams I've worked with, if you're not careful, you get the cool kids and the legacy kids, and it's the in and the out group, right? It's that difference. And you're saying that our brains are hardwired to basically react to that difference, to the other is bad in our brains.
We have to either override that with just our more developed logical brain and start to recognize it, or we have to sort of hack that process. We have to trick ourselves into bringing people into that in-group. And that's where the storytelling and the play can kind of come in. I think even just knowing that this is a thing, you start to notice it everywhere. You watch a group of people and you see how they're referring. We at Contently, there very much for a while was this old Contently and new Contently.
Yeah, it happens in every team. You could be a company, probably walk down the hall here, you could probably find a team that's only been around for 6 months and there's the old and the new.
This idea of identity, I've been sort of obsessed, and I wish I had put it in the book, but this idea of keeping your identity small when you're problem solving so that you're not thinking of yourself. It's like how often do you get asked in a board meeting or something, as a woman, what do you think of this? And it's like that's
it's
already
the only way I can think of it.
Right. It's like you have a lot more than that, but that it's already priming you to think from a place of identity where if you're wrong, your identity and your whole category is maybe at risk. That is not good.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears to talking, while we're talking about the other, you talk about provocation and the fact that you need what you call, you need these flamethrowers, the provocateurs that you call them. When I was working, just the idea, I had to learn to invite critics in. It's really hard as a team leader, as a colleague. So tell us, how do we think about provocation?
Yeah. So Bayard Rustin is one of my favorite characters in history. He was the guy that was sort of the behind-the-scenes guy on the March on Washington. He was one of MLK's sort of right-hand guys, and he kind of hid in the background because he was gay, and that was a time when that was going to sort of sink people's opinions. Such an amazing guy, and he said that every community, every group needs an angelic troublemaker or two.
I love that, angelic troublemaker.
Yeah, where you're actually, if you want to make more progress, sometimes you need to get pushed into that zone of friction. And so there's this idea of provocation. You're only going to see as far as you can see. Even if you have a group of people, sometimes your own success leads you to be blind to other options, better ways, and this is how disruption happens. So inviting in someone who's not going to make you happy and agree with you, but actually push you to see what you don't want to see is great. I actually use this in my writing process. Since working on this, I realized that there's one in particular, the person who tore me apart the most viciously and justifiably in the press, wrote this article using me as an example for everything that's wrong with some part of the world. That stung really bad, but he and I have traded emails asking each other to critique our work before we publish it. It's a good way to neutralize an enemy.
It really is.
But his comments really helped my process much more than my writing partner Joe, who I co-wrote a book with, who now we think very similarly.
We've got our office dog here. So we're getting lots of questions about this idea of creativity and provocation. So I'm going to try to hit a couple of them. Wendy Wexel asks, what have you found to be sort of the core challenge of sort of getting this creativity in teams, and how do you get over it? So provocation is maybe one way. What are a couple of other ways to get a team to be more creative? Yeah,
part of it is, I've been kind of workshopping this analogy. You can tell me if it's okay. If you're going to make a cake, you're not going to make a cake with 3 types of flour and that's it, right? By definition, you need different ingredients. That's sort of a non-starter. But so often we say, well, all the flour gets along together and we're happy, so that means we'll make progress. It doesn't necessarily mean so. But if you have the flour and the eggs and the milk, that does nothing if you don't actually mash them together. And that doesn't turn into anything unless you actually have it change state in the oven. So everyone needs to change. So that's sort of I don't know if that analogy works for you, but
you have to create the right conditions. You have to force them coming together.
So it starts with the people that you invite as input to the process, or you invite on the team to actively work together. Without that, it's very hard. And then after that, it's about stoking that, finding alternative perspectives to look at things and inviting that. The provocation is one. There's another thing I'm big on that I call cognitive expansion, which basically is you can't see further than you can see. So the way to see further than you would normally even consider is actually to pay attention to bad ideas. Ideas that are so far out there.
You have a really great example of the black square, a piece of art. But so basically you're saying come in with a really bad idea, and you're going to get your team to a more creative place.
Yes, because
I love that. So brainstorming is kind of worthless in a group anyway, right?
Right.
But you're suggesting what? Start with a bad idea and brainstorm from there?
So the only brainstorming studies I've found where a group of people actually comes up with better ideas together than alone and adding their lists up are the ones where you invite a crazy person whose stuff is just so out there that everyone has a little subconscious psychological permission to put stuff out that's a little more risky. Or where you start off with some really terrible ideas that would never work. And that does the same thing. But I think the key is actually being curious about things that seem crazy or seem far out there, because even if they are crazy, there's intellectual territory between it. So in the black square, it's like, this is a useless painting. The guy tried to start this crazy religion around this painting of a black square. Not that pretty, but once you know the story, is that everyone thought art was this thing over here. It was about portrayal and making things that kind of represented real life in some way. But between that and this black square is actually using art as a means of communication. Graphic design was born because some guy, one of his students, was curious enough to say, well, what if we actually played with the ideas he has, even though they're kind of crazy? And one of those ideas was separating art from portrayal. And that created graphic design. So I think that's really powerful.
So Laura asked, how do you create a whole culture of creative thinking and a whole creative team? I mean, some of what I'm taking what you're saying, I think it's almost like as a leader of a team, you have to have somebody in the group who is designated as the provocateur. You have to be the one that's saying, but let's start with a bad idea. So there's a responsibility of a team leader to make sure you're bringing these things in.
I think so too. Yeah, or even as an individual creative person, inviting that provocation into your process. The other thing too is when you invite it, it makes it hurt less when it's not what you want to hear. But yes, I think the team leader's responsibility is to put the group in a zone where they're having that cognitive friction, and sometimes that takes provocation, and then also to pull things off of the cliff when they recognize that things are getting personal or we're getting off track. Someone's losing an argument, so they throw in the red herring or the straw man or whatever. understanding those kinds of things so that you can gently pull people together and keep it about ideas, that's extremely important. I think that's our, I ramble a lot about this stuff, but our idea of what a leader is, historically and prehistorically, is the big, strong one, usually a man who's tall and will go out to battle first and be stoic and not change, right? Because that's safety.
Yeah.
But I think the leaders of the future, and there's data that backs this up from interviews with Fortune 500 CEOs, surveying them on what does the leader of your company next need. It's creativity, it's adaptability, it's flexibility.
I totally believe that.
You have
and
to
it's
start with that.
It's a team leader as a coach. So you're coming in to lead your dream team as the coach. In fact, you talk about, one of the things I want to get to, you talk about humility and intellectual humility. And so I think as a leader, you have to be able to have perspective and know what you know and know what you don't. Talk about humility. You use Malcolm X as an example in the book of someone who had incredible humility. It was a surprising story.
Yeah, I love his story. I love that guy. So you're right. The leader needs to be the one to recognize their own intellectual fallibility first, or everyone else is going to be scared to admit they're wrong too. And that means that people will get entrenched in their arguments, or stubborn, or politics happen. So the leader needs to be vulnerable first about that. Intellectual humility is the ability to, breaks down into 4 things. Respect other viewpoints, not be intellectually overconfident, so know that you could be wrong. Separating your ego from your intellect, so it can't hurt too bad when you're found out you're wrong, and then revising your viewpoint when necessary. And that's really hard. But that, I think, is the key ingredient for these teams. So Malcolm X is an example. So changing your religion is one of the hardest things that you can do, I think, in your life, because it's so attached to identity and family. He changed religions twice. He was in prison and he converted to the Nation of Islam and became this preacher. He became the face of it. And when he learned that organization as it was then was not good, basically, and he had all of this on the line, he changed to Sunni Islam and started preaching this message of peace instead of violence. And he used to be the enemy of Dr. King and Bayard Rustin, and he was anti-civil rights movement. He was pro-separation, and even started negotiating deals with the Nazi Party for the thing that they both wanted, which is get white people and black people away from each other. And then he changed his mind about that, knowing that it would be the death of him. That's why he was assassinated. He started preaching this other message that
this idea of being willing to change your point of view, be humble. Speaking of that, Sandra Supel-Moria asked a question. She says, I'm learning to be agile. And so this idea of humility, I think, comes into this. How does I like self-directed teams, she says, and servant leadership. How do you level the playing field? I mean, certainly the humility seems to be part of it, but what you're talking about is a very non-hierarchical, is willing to be flexible, that's agile.
Yeah.
How do you think about what Sandra's asking?
Oh, I like this question. So how do you level the playing field? I mean, there's a few things, right? You need to give people the permission, and not just say it, but actual permission to bring things that are not what everyone else is saying.
I'm big on that. You have to people have to feel safety, and they have to hold themselves accountable, right?
Yes, and that starts with the leader doing that too.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of, so when you're putting a team together for a project, say, or to solve a particular problem, being thoughtful about only bringing people who are going to add something new at the very least, and giving them the implicit and explicit permission to find whatever path to, the group's purpose as you can. I really like Jeff Bezos from Amazon says, be stubborn on vision and flexible on the details, on strategy. So if everyone is devoted to where you're going, and then you say you have the freedom to take any route to help us get there, that's really powerful.
I'm a big believer in that. It's really setting about, sort of being clear on the mission. So for Sandra, maybe keep going on vision, right?
Yep.
And then you're saying allow people the room to figure it out.
Yep.
Another question that came in from Rob Galib, sort of the anti to that is, how do you prevent groupthink?
Yeah.
Because when we're talking about tension and conflict, you also point out that people can get along too well and think they're just invincible on a team.
Yeah.
How do you prevent that? Clearly, it's an issue for all of us.
Yeah. Well, and part of the trouble is the longer you work together, the more you tend to converge on certain perspectives. Yeah. And this idea of cognitive entrenchment, that you've succeeded doing something, maybe you're the best in the world at it. How you get disrupted is a new mountain peak forms because there's an earthquake, things change, and someone else finds that. And that is what groupthink is. Actually, I think best practices are very dangerous because they say there is a way to do things. And groupthink is very easy. A lot of it is because we want to belong to our superordinate goal is to belong, not to push things forward. And the leaders need to stop promoting people for following the party lines and start promoting people who actually push things forward.
And keep reminding people, I've always found to keep reminding people, what are we in this for? What problem are we trying to solve? Why are we here? Not necessarily your view versus the other view.
Yeah.
So in the time we have left, this is Changemaker Book Club. Thanks for your questions. In the time we have left, I like to end this with, okay, so people who are watching this, they're going to go back to work tomorrow or give the weekend and they'll go back to work on Monday. What are a couple things they need to do to change themselves and change their team? So one, I wanted you to think about that, but to summarize, in the book, it's really well written, so congratulations. You talk about sort of the summary of what it takes to make a good team. You have to value difference. We've talked about getting a different perspective, engage openly and candidly, be willing to take different points of view, invite provocation and dissent, need for boundless curiosity, mutual respect. So those sound like great things, but let's do a few of that. Let's give people some checklists. In fact, you end the book with a checklist. I'm looking for some of the questions. So one of the questions from Megan, I thought this would be a good way to get to that, is what's the question that leaders need to ask team members so they can thrive? So let's start with, okay, those are the criteria. What questions, what are one or two questions that you might ask to get better teamwork?
I think it's really important to find out people's stories. Your personal story is the best thing that can humanize you to someone, to build empathy with someone that then builds trust and allows you to have the hard conversations to actually provoke and dissent and push back. I think that, it's getting to know people at an individual level, and storytelling is a really great way to do that. My favorite question in hiring actually is sort of a meta question on this. I like to ask people, when is a time in your life where you changed your mind about something really difficult? Because one, that's going to produce a story that's probably going to be very personal, which is going to help you both feel more empathy, make it easier to work together on hard things. And the second is that's a case of intellectual humility. Intellectual humility, I think, is the number one skill that we could develop. I would say if there's, I want to answer the other questions, if there's one thing anyone watching this can do, it's take the assessment to assess your intellectual humility across all those four factors. And you'll be surprised. Everyone thinks they're open-minded. 95% of people think they're more open-minded than average, and that's not true. I took the test and I realized that I have, as separating my ego from intellect problem, that gives you a to-do list. That gives you action items for things you can work on to be a better contributor. You can actually, the quiz is at my website, shanesnow.com/IH for intellectual humility. I think that is the meta thing that can help anyone with any of this stuff. But
so really you're saying to develop the team by working on yourself.
Yes.
A couple more questions. How do you recruit? A couple of quick tips that you've learned. I mean, one is you're trying to ask them these questions. How do you know they're the right fit? Do you just, increasingly it's almost like people need to work together, sort of like a trial run before you know you're going to be a team. How do you hire people to be on your team? I think
that's really important. A couple of things. One is at Contently, I actually banned the term culture fit because I think that too easily, the intention's good. We want people to be happy working together, but what we don't want is everyone to think together. We don't want group thinking, we don't want people thinking alike. So whenever someone says culture fit, it's almost a ritual now. We say, actually, let's talk about culture add. We don't want the fit, we want someone to contribute.
I love that.
That's one. The other is...
So what you're saying is they got to add to the culture. What do they add, not do they fit? That's just such a great way to force difference.
Yeah, and asking people for their stories is a very good way to get at those things that are extra to the checklist of skills you're looking for. The other thing I would say is think of team building like a movie director. You're casting a team, you're not building a team. If you're filming a movie, you're not going to get the 20 actors with the best GPA from Harvard. That would be ridiculous.
Yeah.
You're also not filming a new movie in a new genre, solving a new problem with the same 20 actors you had in the last movie. I think we need to think of who we put on the team in terms of how are we going to get that cognitive diversity. Then the leader helps sort of put things in that right zone of friction and help inject intellectual humility. But I think we need to not be so fixed about that. And when you start thinking of hiring as people who add, people who are going to stretch each other, just like actors that bring out the best in each other, not the easy thing to do that doesn't get you fired, which is get the people who have the best grades or the best pedigree.
Yeah.
They're going to think a lot more alike than you're going to ideally want.
So some good tips, just to reiterate things we talked about earlier. I think we also talked about making sure you are bringing in different perspectives, just making room for play, having fun, bringing bad ideas to the table to encourage people to be creative. Those are a few of the takeaways that I took. Do you like dream? Do you know your dream team? I mean, do you know your own strengths? And how do you think about the weaknesses that you go forward in building a team? Because that's a lot of what I hear you saying, right?
It's recognizing that if the team is going to count on you being the hero, you being the smartest one, then guess what? You're going to lose to someone else who's smarter. You need to think about the team has to be smarter than you. And your job as the leader is to form the team and run the team that can do that.
I think that's such an important point as we wrap up. I think for everyone, it's whether you're leading a team or being part of a team, reminding yourself all the time, what's my role here? And I'm not to be the smartest, I'm not to dominate. We are a team. When I think of my career, working with others, collaborating, dream teams have been the highlight of my career. I mean, really, when you look back at what you've done, it's what you accomplished, but really it's the work with the people.
It's the magic when it clicks, and it's rare, but
is rare.
That's the most fulfilling.
And then finally, if someone's watching this, to wrap up, if they're not right now in a moment with their team, that they're in magic, what encouragement do you have to give to people who are maybe sort of struggling with the team dynamic that's not so good?
Yeah, I think, one is assessing who's on the team and what are the things that are causing people to go after their own goals versus the team's goals. And sometimes that means you're going to change the cast, but sometimes that's going to mean reorienting people around, like focusing on that vision and purpose, using storytelling to kind of explain that and get people to care about that. But I think humanizing everyone on the team, stop talking about people in terms of categories, the sales team versus the marketing team. Have coffee with every member of the sales team, get to know who they are.
And also there they go again, right?
Yes.
You do tend to put people in those categories.
Yeah. Those are the kinds of things that little by little help. And sometimes, a group of people is not the right group of people to work together. We need to be okay with that.
Yeah. Well, great. Dream Team. Shane Snow, your third book, congratulations. I think it's a great read, good stories, and what I think is also really useful is you have a really good checklist at the back for people to go through and sort of think about how do you form a team. So this has been Changemaker Book Club. Thanks for the engagement. Dream Team, Shane Snow. We'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.